Hey, church family, we thought that we would help Pastor Jessica out by asking the kids what this word means and how to say it. Let's take a look at what they have to say. So what do you think it says?
Habakkuk. 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 Haki. Ook. Habakkuk. Habakkuk. Apple. Habakkuk.
What do you think this means, Habakkuk?
God is the Holy One of our shepherd, like worship. It sounds like it means like a boat or something. A First Nation sing for like a tradition or anything. Like a tradition, like you celebrate it. Maybe a celebration.
Celebrate. Ooh yeah. Ooh.
Showing a bad example. It means that we figure out everyone without even you telling us.
You know that temple where there was only a select few that could go inside? I think that's this.
The golden temple with the thingy plate.
Giving animals cooked food.
Camel.
A chicken dancing in the world.
Keep the nature clean. I think it means like helping someone else.
What do you think it means?
I don't know.
You don't know?
Yeah.
That's okay. Neither do I, to be completely honest with you. It's a very confusing word. We're really struggling with this one. Pastor Jessica, maybe you can help us out with this.
Well, give it up for our kids. I was impressed by their reading skills as well as their knowledge. The one about the Holy of Holies, I was really impressed with how much our kids know. Now, thank you to them for setting up the last week of our series called A Way Out, where we have been looking at the minor prophets. And if you hadn't guessed, today we're going to be looking at the book of, say it with me, Habakkuk. Habakkuk. Now, Habakkuk is an interesting prophetic book. It's quite short. It's only 3 chapters long. And it's not a story. It's not a narrative, but rather it's a recorded conversation between God and his prophet. And they have this back and forth dialogue. They both are talking. So it gives us a really unique look into the life of prayer when it comes to a prophet. Now, through this series, we have been learning that God has been speaking to the prophets, and the prophets were actually God's chief reminding officers. They reminded the people of God about who he was and what he had said, especially in seasons where the people had forgotten it. And God had established this special kind of relationship with his prophets, where he spoke to them and they would deliver messages from God to the people. See, the prophets could clearly hear and understand the voice of God, which I think is so interesting. This was a gift from God that he had given to his people, and these were the people that continually found themselves in cycles of ignoring and not heeding the voice and the instructions of their God. It was similar to the cycle of a tree. Now, your first science lesson ever in elementary school was probably the life cycle, or close to it, of a tree. I've always been fascinated with the connectivity of nature, especially the idea that a tree story starts long before you ever see it. Now, I bet you're wondering, why would Pastor Jessica bring a tree on the stage this morning? Well, a couple of weeks ago, you'll remember that Pastor Jonathan shared with us that his favorite team was the Toronto Maple Leafs. And so that got me thinking about leaves, and I thought I would bring you my favorite leaf, a fig tree. Now, did you know that a fig tree is not native to Canada? You can grow them here now, but they never actually started here. Rather, in the late 1800s, immigrants from around the world would carry all sorts of seeds and saplings as they traveled across the ocean. And they would carefully wrap these seeds and these saplings in strips of linen, and then they would tuck them into the corners of their pockets, of their trunks, and their suitcases. And they would bring a piece of their home country to their new home in Canada. And when they arrived here, they would need to learn how to help these trees and plants thrive in a very different climate with changing seasons. And they had to help them grow from small trees to backyard focal points. Now, in fact, if you were to walk through the neighborhoods of Toronto, you would find big, beautiful fig trees scattered in the backyards of our city. And they are from seeds that immigrated over here years and years ago. And if you were ever lucky to see one of those fig trees and pick the warm fruit from its branches, the fruit that you would be holding is a part of a cycle that started hundreds of years ago across the world. And of course, if you were to take that fruit and harvest the seeds that you got from that fruit, the cycle could start all over again. And just like the cycle of a tree, the people of God continually followed the same patterns over and over and over. And as the book of Habakkuk starts, the children of God once again find themselves in this stage, the disobedient stage. And they're choosing their ways over God's ways. And God had warned them to turn back, to come back to him, to choose obedience. But guess what? They hadn't listened. And so they were headed now into a season of punishment. And as the book of Habakkuk starts, he watches all of this unfold, and he feels a certain way about it. He's quite confused and puzzled why God would seemingly allow evil to keep thriving. It doesn't make sense to the prophet Habakkuk, and he kind of gets quite vocal with it when he talks to God. I find it fascinating from the very start of the book. It's almost as if God is welcoming Habakkuk's questions. It's almost as if God wants Habakkuk to be completely honest with him. And so Habakkuk starts out his book, and he makes this big, bold accusation. He says, "How long, O Lord, must I call for help? But you do not listen. Violence is everywhere. I cry, but you do not come to save." You see, Habakkuk here is carrying a burden, and it's not his burden, because he has a great relationship with God. He has a connection with God. But the problem is the community of people that he's leading, as well as all of humanity, they are so far from what it looks like to follow or honor God. And as we read through the chapter, Habakkuk begins to complain about how much misery there is in the world. He says destruction and violence are increasing. The law, he says, has become paralyzed. There's no justice in the courts. People love to argue and they love to fight. And justice has become, he says, perverted because the wicked people far outnumber the righteous people. And Habakkuk says that all of this is God's fault because he will not listen and he will not intervene. It's like he's letting humanity off the hook. It has nothing to do with them and their actions and everything to do with the fact that God will not move. And Habakkuk says, "I cry, but you will not come and save." Now, I don't know about you, but I can relate to how Habakkuk is feeling about the world. Often I look at what is happening in our world, in our society, in the news, in places that have seemed to forget that there is a just God. And I too quietly wonder, what is happening? Why is God not seemingly intervening? I just don't know if I've ever been as bold as Habakkuk to place the blame right at God's feet. But reading through this part of Habakkuk's conversation, I think there's something that maybe you can learn, and it's this. Habakkuk models for us the way to weep. Now I wonder, are you someone who likes to weep? Are you someone who likes to get your emotions out? I know there are people like this where it just feels really great to actually weep and cry and get it out. I am not one of these people. I am not an overly emotional person. I tend to like to keep everything locked in. I think it's because I like to feel in control, feeling out of control when I'm weeping. So I prefer just to kind of hold it all in. But I'm really challenged by what C.S. Lewis once penned, and he said this: "I sat with my anger long enough until she told me that her real name was grief." And if I'm honest, I can feel a lot more times angry than I feel sad. It's sometimes easier for me to label my emotions as anger when it comes to injustice, but I wonder, is it angry that I'm feeling, or is it grief, or is it both? Sometimes I think we are tempted to believe that we shouldn't go to God with our very real emotions because maybe it means that we don't trust him. So we sanitize our feelings. We wait until our anger is subdued. We carefully select our words, and we calmly approach our Creator with a list of needs and wants, almost as if this calm demeanor is the mark of a really good Christian. But from what we read, Habakkuk, the prophet, is a bit reckless with his emotions, reckless with his words, even his anger and his feelings. He's mad, and he wants God to know it. He's confused, and he is not hiding his frustration from God. His grief is deep. It's overwhelming. He doesn't sanitize his words, but rather he boldly accuses the creator of the universe for not caring about the world. So he lashes out. But interestingly, God seems to welcome his words. God seems to welcome his emotion. God seems to make space for Habakkuk's frustrations. Friends, do we go to God like this? I wonder. Are we brave enough to go to God and tell him what we are really thinking and feeling? Do you go to God with your raw emotions, or are you tempted to deal with your raw emotions before you go to God in prayer? If you're honest, maybe like me, you would admit that you're tempted to treat prayer as an activity instead of a relationship. We're tempted to come to God with our carefully curated list of wants and needs. Often, we've edited the list before we even bring it to him, almost like we're calling up one of our service providers, like the bank or a cable company, to discuss a few issues that we've been having. And so we call up the number, we wait on the line, automated voice picks up, "Hello, God here. How can I help you today?" But the conversation that we read between Habakkuk and God is so much different than a phone call to a service provider. Habakkuk is angry and he is confused. He's hurting. His emotions are making him make these big accusations like, "The world is a mess, God, because you will not get involved." And this type of conversation that he's having with God is actually called lament. And lament in its very simplest form is to express grief or sorrow, to mourn what is evil and not right here on the earth. This is what we do in our most cherished and trusted relationships. We lament. We share our feelings. We vocalize our doubts, our fears, our worries, our questions. We complain sometimes about what is frustrating us. And then what do we do? We seek comfort from the people who care about us. Do we do this with God? A few weeks ago, our staff team has been studying prayer, and we were practicing lament together as a team. And during one of our sessions, the pastor who was leading us said this: "We often find prayer boring because we are not really praying. Rather, we are performing." And it caused me to wonder, maybe our prayer lives are not dynamic because we have sanitized all of our emotions and all of our feelings out of them, almost as if we don't want to offend God with our words. And as a result, we'll send God a list of our prayer list rather than going to him with our honest, raw, and real emotions. Friends, God invites us to be honest with him. Rather than hide our doubts and our worries away from him, he says he wants us to pile it all on him. As humans, we are often tempted to think that we need to be perfect when we go and approach God, that I have to get everything in order in my life before I go to him and ask him for anything. But friends, God can handle our mess. He can handle our anger. He can handle our frustration. He can handle our grief. He can handle even our lack of trust in him, just like he was able to handle Habakkuk's lack of trust. Psalms 142:2 says this, pour out, not sprinkle, not a little bit, pour out your complaints before God and tell him all of your troubles. Now, as we're about to see, Habakkuk's lament actually unlocks a really honest conversation between him and God. Rather than shutting Habakkuk down and saying, okay, let's do it your way, God engages in conversation with him. And we continue to read that God says something along the lines of like, since you've been brutally honest with me, Habakkuk, let me get really honest with you. And he goes on to tell Habakkuk what is about to happen. And unfortunately for Habakkuk, it is not the answer that he has been hoping for. God responds to him and he says this, I'm going to do something that you wouldn't believe. I'm sure Habakkuk's excited. Yes, God, what are you going to do? It's going to be better than what I think. I'm raising up the Babylonians. They hate them. A cruel and violent people. They will march across the world and they will conquer you. And the reason God is going to do this is to punish his people. Now, this is the complete opposite of what Habakkuk has asked God to do. He wants God to intervene. He wants God to stop evil. He wants God to bring his people back to him. But instead, God lets Habakkuk know that he is going to use Babylon to overtake God's people as their punishment for disobedience. And Habakkuk is so beyond confused at this point. He understands why God must punish his people, but he has huge concerns about how God is going to punish his people. And he goes on to question God, and he says this, you must be joking. I don't think you understand, God, what is at stake. The Babylonians, really? They are even more disobedient than your own people. Has it escaped your attention, God? Have you ever asked God that? How has it escaped your attention, God? Did you notice something over here? He says, has it escaped your attention, God, that the Babylonians detest everything that is godly? They don't like you. Don't you understand? They're going to kill us, and then they're going to go to their false gods, and they are going to worship them and thank them for helping them. You can't be serious. Surely, God, and then he says this, you won't condone evil. Habakkuk goes as far to say this, I can't believe it. Will you wink at their treachery? As if God, the creator of the world, is winking at evil. Will you be silent while the wicked swallow up people more righteous than them? Friends, these are very bold accusations that Habakkuk is making. Have you ever felt like God would wink at someone else's evil doings in your life? Instead of honoring your own obedience and your own faithfulness. There have been times, many times in my life, many times in a week, where it costs me to live the Jesus way. Especially when I look around at others who are not living in obedience and they are seemingly thriving. At my core, you know what, I'll be really honest with you, I am not a generous person. It is very hard for me, very painful to choose obedience when it comes to my finances. I have this hoarder mentality, I'm sure I'm the only one, where I want to keep everything that I feel is mine. And it's an area of my discipleship where I've had to choose extreme obedience in my life. It's a discipline that I have had to perfect, and I've actually had to make a choice here before it ever affected my heart. Now, because Jesus instructs his followers to invest their finances into his kingdom, God asks for 1/10 of my own earnings, not because God needs it, he doesn't, but because God knows that I need to let go and let him be in control. This is a really hard practice for me, to trust God with this area of my life. But every week, what I do is I give to this church, which is the church that I love. But you know what it does? It costs me something personally every single week. And like Habakkuk, I can look around at other people in my life and I can ask God, what about them? God, what about them? Why do they have more than me, even though I'm a follower of you and I am living in obedience when it comes to my finances? It doesn't make sense, God. It certainly is not the way that I think things should go. And if I'm honest, God and I wrestle with this thought all the time, weekly for sure. And Habakkuk does the same thing. Habakkuk models for us the way to wrestle. This type of conversation he is having is known as wrestling. And we see it throughout Scripture. The Bible records many incidences where there's characters who wrestle with God. Jacob wrestles with God. David wrestles with God. They're wrestling in these significant moments where they question the plans that God is putting forth. Even Jesus, as he was headed towards the cross, wrestled with the idea. He had some real emotions of fear, anguish, pain, worry. And he says to God, God, if there is any other way that we can go about doing the saving of the world, let's go ahead and choose that. But then he follows it up by saying, but not my will, but your will. Not what I want, God, in this moment in my humanity, but what you want. See, Jesus and Habakkuk weren't wrestling with God. They were wrestling with God's will. Like Jesus, Habakkuk's heart has always been for God's justice and obedience of the people. It's clear from the very first time that he speaks, he wants to see God's justice reign in the world. But when God suggests that his plan is to actually use the evil Babylonians to administer the punishment to God's people, Habakkuk starts to wrestle really, really hard. See, Habakkuk doesn't have a problem with God. Habakkuk has a problem with God's ways. And if we're honest, there's probably a lot of things that God allows in my life that I wouldn't. See, the justice of Jessica looks very different from the justice of Jesus. It's why I wrestle all the time with him. I'm ashamed to admit that I've thought multiple times this week, if I were God, I would act in this way. Have you ever thought that? If I were God, I would do it this way. And if I'm honest, I wrestle with God's plans. I wrestle with his will. I wrestle with how he chooses to move and what he chooses to do in this world much more often than I'd even care to admit as your pastor standing here on the stage. But there's a verse in the Bible that can be incredibly comforting to us in regards to this, but it's also a little bit frustrating. It's a bit polarizing. And it wouldn't have just been polarizing to us, but also the original hearers of that day. See, in this passage, God is speaking to his people once again, and he's speaking through a prophet named Isaiah, and he's telling them that he's going to do this amazing rescue plan. He's going to send them a Messiah, and then he says, this Messiah is going to be for all the people, including the Gentiles. And the problem is they adamantly oppose the Gentiles. They don't want them a part of God's plan. And so they wrestle with God in this truth. And God goes on to say this to them. He says, for my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts are higher than your thoughts. You see, wrestling is a natural human tendency in response to God's ways being different than my ways. And because Habakkuk does not understand God's ways or his will, he wrestles with him. He questions it. He opposes it. He even tries to illuminate for God what he thinks he might be missing. Have you ever done that where you're going through a situation? God's going to do this and you're like, oh God, maybe you don't know this detail. Let me show it to you. And then all of a sudden, you'll understand why we should go with my way instead of your way. And God wrestles back with him, though. God does not cave in and give him what he wants. God does not even cut Habakkuk down for speaking so boldly to him. Instead, God says, well, Habakkuk, we're going to do it my way. But let me help you come to terms with it. See, God reassures Habakkuk that though his way might seem unclear to him, he cares deeply about justice, and God is faithful. When he gives a promise, he will fulfill it. And in chapter 2, God encourages Habakkuk, trust my plan. And I promise that justice will come in due time. And so God tells Habakkuk, go and write this down. And the reason he wants him to write it down is so that it's not just knowledge for Habakkuk, but it's knowledge for all the people of God that they can turn to, especially in dark seasons where they start to not think that they can trust God. He says, write this down. So when it seems slow in coming, which it will, you can wait patiently, for it will surely take place. And then God goes on to outline 5 different woes, the Bible says, that God is going to use, that even in this season of punishment for his people, at the hands of their enemies, God has not forgotten justice. And so he wants them to trust his character to administer justice in his timing and in his way. God assures them, I have not forgotten your suffering. I will deal with all injustice. And then he goes on to outline these 5 woes. And this is what God says. I will deal with those who oppress and exhort others. That's incredibly comforting for us today, isn't it? God says, I will deal with those who take what is not theirs. I will deal with those who build nations through violence. I will deal with those who manipulate and hurt other people. And I will deal with those who worship false gods. See, God promises that there will come a day where he will hold Babylon and also any future Babylons accountable for their actions. Nothing escapes his attention, and all injustice will be punished. And this assurance allows Habakkuk to take a deep breath. He's probably been holding it for a long time. Because although God doesn't agree to do exactly what he wants him to do, or in his timing, there's a shift in the conversation that happens between chapter 2 and chapter 3. It's almost as if Habakkuk remembers, oh yeah, I can trust God. And he's able to stop with the wrestling, and he comes to accept that God's ways are different, higher, even better than his own. And the final chapter of Habakkuk, chapter 3, is this beautiful prayer that Habakkuk offers up. And he responds to God and he says, I've heard all about you, Lord. From the time I was a little boy, I know everything about you. And I am filled with awe by your amazing works. He remembers all God has done. Oh yeah, I can trust you. In this time of our deep need, help us again, as you did in years gone by. And in your anger, God, would you remember your mercy? What a difference in his tone. What a difference in his voice, in his words that he chooses to use, and the approach that he has to God. Habakkuk has found peace as he prays this prayer, even though he knows there's a very difficult path ahead. And as he does this, Habakkuk is modeling for us the way to wait. And we do not like that word, do we? See, in this prayer, Habakkuk reminds himself of who God is by declaring out loud the characteristics of his creator. He says this, your brilliant splendor fills the heavens. The earth is filled with your praise. Your coming is as brilliant as the sunrise. When you stop, the earth shakes. When you look, the nations tremble. You shatter the everlasting mountains and you level the eternal hills. You are the eternal one. This is such a beautiful declaration because Habakkuk here has accepted who he is, which is a fallen, flawed, imperfect human, and who God is, the great creator who is perfect and just. I imagine, because he's human, Habakkuk still prefers that God would do it his way, but he has come to a place of peace and acceptance. He's willing to allow God to lead his life. And it's this relationship that Habakkuk has with God that actually allows him to get to this place. He never would have been able to get to a place of acceptance and peace and understanding and trusting God if he did not have this beautiful prayer journey with God. If he hadn't come to a point of saying, your way is better than my way. You see, prayer has unlocked for Habakkuk a way to weep, a way to wrestle, and a way to wait on God. Habakkuk has learned that lament will actually deepen our relationship with God. It will allow us to value presence with him over a performance to him. Habakkuk has learned that wrestling will change his perspective. It gives space for God to respond to our questions and our emotions and our fears and our doubts. And finally, Habakkuk has learned that waiting is a place where you can accept that God's ways are different than your own. It puts him into a posture of praise, like we heard in his voice. And at the end of his prayer, Habakkuk makes this beautiful confession. And he says this, I will wait quietly for the coming day when disaster will strike the people who invade us. Even though the fig trees have no blossoms and there are no grapes on the vines, even though the olive crop fails and the fields lie empty and barren, even though the flocks die in the fields and the cattle barns are empty, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in the God of my salvation. And I wonder, what's your even though? Even though blank happens in my life, still I will trust you, God. Even if this happens, still I will trust you. Habakkuk says, even though the waiting time will be excruciatingly long, I'm going to choose to place my trust in God. I'm going to remember that he is faithful. I love the agricultural references that he uses because this was the reality of their lives. Crops failed. Barns remained empty. Flocks sometimes died. And fig trees sometimes didn't blossom. Now, any gardener will tell you that a fig tree is very finicky. They require extraordinary amounts of care and detail to ensure that it can get to the phase where it actually bears much fruit. To grow a fig tree like this in Canada requires a large amount of effort. Even though after those seeds I was telling you about, after they've been unwrapped in their new home and planted into the ground, it would take years, sometimes even decades, for a gardener to ever be able to eat the fruit from the tree. Because the process required to get it to a stage where it bared much fruit was actually really difficult, especially year after year of going through a Canadian winter. Each year, the gardener must start this very unusual ritual. And what would happen is near the end of October, the gardener would take the branches of the fig tree and they would bind them up together with twine. And then the tree would be wrapped in burlap, tight and tight and tight, all of a sudden so that it could not even move. It could not even flow freely. It was cocooned. Now, having completed this step, the gardener would move their attention to the yard. And they would measure out and dig a really long, deep trench in the yard, big enough that could actually cradle the tree. And the gardener would take some burlap and they would also line this hole with burlap so that the tree could be fully cocooned. And after they had made that big trench in the ground, with gentle precision, they would carefully unearth the root systems of the tree. And they would lift the tree from its comfortable home, and they would transplant it into the earth, lying it horizontally down inside the trench. And finally, after all this work was completed, they would use their shovel and they would heap on piles and piles of dirt so that every leaf and every branch and the trunk and every root was covered by the dirt until all that remained was a mound of dirt. Now, it seems strange, doesn't it, that you would nurture a tree only to uproot it and bury it deep beneath the earth. But this is what must be done because a fig tree was not meant to endure a long, cold Canadian winter. See, left exposed, the fig tree will die, but hidden under the ground, the tree can wait patiently for the promise of spring. I'm sure the waiting season was as agonizing for the gardener as it is for the tree. Imagine for a second, you are this tree. Last summer, you bloomed beautifully, but the cold air has come, and your roots have been torn from the soil where you were firmly planted. Your branches have been bound, and you've been tucked away in darkness. And as the earth is heaped on top of you, the world becomes colder, and it becomes darker. And then for an agonizing, long season, you wait in silence, completely unsure of what is going on and what lies ahead. Unsure if you will ever experience the promise of spring or the warm sun again. Perhaps this is how Habakkuk and the people of God felt as they waited the following days and months and years, clinging to the promise that God had made for justice, living out their punishment at the hands of their enemies, surrounded by silence and uncertainty. Years later, this is for sure how the people of God would have felt as they waited for the promised Messiah to come and rescue them. Decades of darkness, waiting for God to answer their prayers and fulfill on his promises. It's why I love Habakkuk's final prayer so very much, because he has moved from a place of questioning and doubting and wrestling and weeping and despair, and he has now come to a place of peace and abiding, where he can declare that even if the fig tree never blossoms again, he will choose to trust God. See, Habakkuk is modeling for us a life of faith that declares that the gardener knows best. See, God promises that a day will come when he will administer justice, just like a day will come when the Canadian winter will end and the gardener can once again begin to lift the fig tree out of the ground. Gently, the soil will be swept away by the gardener, and light will pierce the darkness that the plant has experienced. Carefully, the tree will be lifted from its resting place, and it will be replanted in its rich, nourishing soil. And once again, the gardener will take all the burlap and the twine off, and it will stretch its branches, and it will stand upright, and it will soak in the warmth of the sun for another season, getting ready to flourish for the seasons ahead. I want you to imagine the joy of those first rays of sunshine touching the fig tree after months buried in the cold, dark earth. A surge of life, a renewal of hope. Friends, that is what faith feels like to us. This is the type of faith that Habakkuk clings to in the closing chapter of his conversation with God, where he knows they are going to go through more difficult seasons. A faith that trusts that even in the stillness of the waiting, the gardener is always at work. It always happens in his timing and in his way. As we close today, I want to offer us 3 reflective questions that I think are helpful for us to ponder and pause on for a moment. The first is this: lament. Do I offer sanitized versions of my prayers, or am I radically candid with God? Is lament a part of your relationship with God? Do you go to him with the things you are actually really feeling? Do you talk to him more than you talk to other people about your frustrations? Are you radically candid with him? Do you tell him what you really think? Or are your sanitized prayers holding you back from an authentic, dynamic relationship with God? The next one is wrestle. Do I leave the conversation before God has the chance to respond? Or am I willing to engage in back and forth dialogue with God? Do you talk? Does God talk back and forth? Do you give him space to actually respond to your requests or talk to you? Can God wrestle back with you? Can God tell you no? Can he tell you what you don't want to hear? Or have you already left the conversation in the prayer before he ever gets a chance to respond to you? The third question is wait. Do I want my ways above God's ways? Or can I lay my head down at night and trust that God is in control? I want you to ask yourself, do you wait on God? Have you ever learned to come to a place where you can actually recognize his ways are better than my own? Do you have peace that comes, and it does, with accepting that you don't know everything, and that is okay? Friends, that is the gift of waiting, where God allows us to have peace, that we can actually lay our head down at night and trust that he is in control. What area of Habakkuk's prayer journey might be missing, and might you want to add in this next season ahead? What if we decided to walk towards Christmas a little bit more committed to embracing an authentic relationship with God? What if we walked towards Christmas more willing to have conversations with God like Habakkuk had? What if we became more willing to tell God exactly how we are and what we're feeling, willing to lament, willing to wrestle and give him space, and willing to wait on him. Friends, the truth is that the God of creation who sent his only son to this world wants to be close to us. He wants to be close to you. Jesus came to this earth, the Bible says, as a baby to be with us. So let's choose to step towards him too. Let's choose to be honest with our fears, honest with our emotions, honest with our doubts, and offer them up to him, recognizing that his will and his ways are different, and they're higher, and they're even better than our own. Let's pray. God, I thank you for the reminders that you gave through the prophets to your people, the way that you consistently guide through your words. And I thank you that there's so much that we can learn from the prophets. So many of the lessons that you taught your people are so applicable to our lives. And I thank you today for the reminder that your ways are different than mine. God, your ways are higher than our own. You are the creator of the universe, God, and sometimes we act as if you're not. You know the intricate details of our lives, God. You know the intricate details of our world, including the injustices we see with our own eyes and the injustices that we don't even know about, God. And so, God, as your people, we step in and ask that you would intervene, God. Would you move in this world, God? Would you bring peace where there is war? Would you bring life where there is death, God? Would you bring healing where there is a need of restoration? God, it is so difficult to watch and wonder what is going on. And I ask that you would help us to turn to you, God. Help us to lament and go to you with things that we don't understand, to ask you to move, God, to petition you to move, God. And I thank you for the promise that nothing gets by your watchful eyes, God. We can trust that you are at work just as the gardener is at work, even in the most difficult and dark of times. God, help us to become a people who are close to you. Help us to learn how to lament, to wrestle, and to wait on you. And as we approach the Christmas season, God, help us to remember that you came close to us. And then help us to take steps to come closer to you. God, we are so grateful for your faithfulness. You are our firm foundation, God, as we sang, and you will always show up, God. And so, God, we declare today your ways are different, but they're also higher, God, and they're better than our own. And in the moments that we struggle, God, in the moments that we wonder, would you help us to find peace in the promises that you are at work in our lives and you are at work in our world. In your name, amen.